The late afternoon sun painted golden streaks across the mahogany tables of the Silver Oak Country Club, where Alexander Pierce sat with his usual glass of expensive whiskey. At 35, he had everything money could buy: a successful tech company, a mansion in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, and a reputation for being impossibly arrogant. On this particular Friday evening, Alexander was getting increasingly annoyed with his friend Thomas Bennett's constant talk about finding true love and settling down. The conversation had started when Thomas announced his engagement to his girlfriend of 2 years. "You know what your problem is, Alex?" Thomas swirled his drink, ice cubes clinking against the crystal glass. "You think everything in life can be bought or controlled. But love? Real connection? That's something your millions can't buy." Alexander let out a sharp laugh. "Please, Thomas. Marriage is just another social contract. People marry for all sorts of reasons: convenience, money, status. Love is just a fairy tale people tell themselves to feel better about their choices." A few other club members nearby turned their heads, interested in the developing argument between the two well-known millionaires. Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. "You really believe that? Then prove it." "What do you mean?" Alexander raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued by the challenge in his friend's voice. "Let's make a bet," Thomas said, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "I bet you can't marry someone of my choosing within 30 days and make the relationship work for at least 6 months. Alexander's lips curved into a confident smirk. "And what do I get when I win?" "That new tech startup you've been eyeing. I'll sell you my shares at half their market value." Thomas knew this would catch Alexander's attention. They'd been competing for control of this promising new company for months. "And if I lose?" Alexander asked, though he couldn't imagine such an outcome. "You give me full control of the Pierce Tower project we're partnering on." Thomas named the luxury apartment complex they were developing together. The stakes were high, but Alexander's pride was higher. "Deal. So who's the lucky woman you have in mind?" Thomas smiled and pulled out his phone. After a few swipes, he turned the screen toward Alexander. "Your new maid, Elena Rodriguez. You hired her last week, right?" Alexander nearly choked on his drink. The photo showed a young woman in simple clothes, probably in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. She was pretty in a natural way, but definitely not the type Alexander usually associated with. "You can't be serious," Alexander protested. "She's a maid." "Exactly," Thomas replied with a knowing smile. "Someone real, hardworking, and completely outside your usual social circle, unless you're afraid you can't do it." Alexander's jaw tightened. If there was one thing he couldn't resist, it was a challenge to his capabilities. He drained his glass and stood up, straightening his designer suit. "Watch me. I'll have her saying I do within 2 weeks." "Remember?" Thomas called after him as he headed for the door. "The marriage has to last 6 months, and you have to actually live together like a real couple, no separate arrangements." Alexander waved dismissively without looking back. His mind was already racing with plans. He'd simply offer the woman enough money to make it worth her while. Everyone had a price. That was one thing his years in business had taught him. What Alexander didn't know as he drove his luxury car home that evening was that this bet would change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. He was so confident in his ability to control the situation that he never considered the possibility that Elena Rodriguez might be more than just a simple maid, or that his carefully constructed world of wealth and privilege was about to be turned upside down. As he pulled into his circular driveway, he caught sight of Elena leaving for the day. She was carrying a worn backpack and waiting for the bus at the corner. Something about her dignified posture and the tired but determined look on her face made him pause for a moment. But he quickly brushed off the feeling. After all, this was just another business deal, wasn't it? Little did Alexander know that his arrogant bet was about to become the biggest gamble of his life, one where the stakes would be far higher than any amount of money or property. Elena Rodriguez stood in Alexander Pierce's enormous kitchen, wiping down the marble counters as she tried to ignore the constant buzzing of her phone. The hospital was calling again, probably about Sophia's medical bills. Her 8-year-old daughter needed another surgery, and the insurance would only cover part of it. Elena's shoulders tensed as she thought about the mounting debt. Just then, Alexander walked into the kitchen wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. She noticed he seemed different today, less dismissive, almost friendly. That made her suspicious immediately. "Elena, could we talk for a moment?" he asked, gesturing toward the dining room. She followed him cautiously, her practical shoes making no sound on the polished floor. In just 1 week of working here, she had learned that wealthy people were rarely interested in talking to their maids unless something was wrong. "Please, sit down," Alexander said, pulling out a chair at the massive dining table. Elena sat down stiffly, her hands folded in her lap. She needed this job desperately and hoped she hadn't done anything wrong. The morning's hospital bills weighed heavily on her mind. "I have an unusual proposal for you," Alexander began, his confident voice echoing in the large room. "I would like you to marry me." Elena stared at him for a long moment, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "Marriage. You and me. For 6 months, minimum." He spoke as if discussing a business deal. "In return, I'll cover all your daughter's medical expenses. Past bills, future treatments, everything." Elena's heart stopped for a moment. How did he know about Sophia's medical needs? Had he investigated her? The thought made her angry, but she couldn't ignore what this could mean for her daughter. "Why me?" she asked carefully, her mind racing. Despite having to take this job as a maid, Elena had a master's degree in business administration. Before her previous company went bankrupt, she had been a senior financial analyst. She knew when something didn't add up. Alexander shifted slightly in his chair. "Let's just say I need to be married quickly, and you seem suitable." Elena almost laughed. Suitable? She had cleaned his bathroom just that morning. "Mr. Pierce, I may be your maid, but I'm not stupid. What's the real reason?" Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise? Maybe respect? He hadn't expected to be challenged. The details aren't important. What matters is that this arrangement could solve your problems and mine. You'll have a comfortable life, your daughter will get the best medical care, and after 6 months, we can quietly divorce. I'll provide a generous settlement. Elena stood up slowly, her mind working through the implications. "I need time to think about it." "Of course," Alexander replied smoothly. "Take the rest of the day off, but I'll need your answer by tomorrow." That evening, Elena sat in her small apartment, watching Sophia sleep. The little girl's dark curls spread across the pillow, her breathing slightly labored due to her condition. Medical bills covered the kitchen table, more than Elena could earn in years at her current jobs. She picked up her phone and Googled Alexander Pierce. Articles about his tech company success popped up, along with photos of him at charity events and business functions. He seemed to have everything, except someone to share it with. There had to be more to this proposal than he was telling her. Elena's business training taught her to always look for hidden motivations. But as she looked at her sleeping daughter and thought about the surgeries she needed, did the reason really matter? The next morning, Elena arrived early at the mansion. She found Alexander in his home office, already working on his laptop. "Yes," she said simply. He looked up, surprised she had interrupted him. "Yes. I'll marry you, but I have conditions." Elena's voice was firm. "First, everything about Sophia's care must be in writing. Second, we need a proper legal agreement about the divorce and settlement. And third," she paused, gathering her courage, "you need to treat me with respect. I won't be your maid anymore, and I won't pretend to be madly in love, but I won't be treated like a purchased possession either." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. Most people didn't dare make demands of him. "Anything else?" "Yes, whatever your real reason is for this arrangement. I don't want to know right now. But no lies between us. We keep things honest, even if we're not sharing everything." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Deal." He extended his hand as if closing a business transaction. Elena shook it firmly, remembering all the business deals she had negotiated in her previous life. But none of those had been quite like this. As she left his office, she wondered if either of them really understood what they were getting into. Neither of them noticed Thomas Bennett watching from his car across the street, a satisfied smile on his face as he saw Elena leaving Alexander's house so early in the morning. Phase 1 of his plan was working perfectly. 2 weeks into their marriage, Alexander sat in his home office, frowning at his laptop screen. His company's new software project was running into problems, and his team couldn't figure out why the numbers weren't adding up. He rubbed his temples, frustration building. Elena walked past the open door, carrying a basket of Sophia's toys to the little girl's new room. She paused when she heard Alexander muttering to himself. "These projections can't be right," he said, not realizing she was there. "We'll lose millions if we launch like this." Elena hesitated. In her old life as a financial analyst, she had handled similar problems countless times. She glanced at the screen from the doorway and immediately spotted the issue. "Your team forgot to account for variable server costs," she said without thinking. Alexander's head snapped up. "What did you say?" Elena bit her lip, but it was too late to take it back. She walked into the office and pointed at his screen. "See these numbers here? They're calculating server costs as a fixed expense, but with cloud computing, the costs will scale up with user growth. That's why the projections look wrong." Alexander stared at her, then at the screen, then back at her. "How do you know about cloud computing costs?" Elena straightened her shoulders. "I used to be a senior financial analyst at TechGrow Solutions before they went bankrupt. I have an MBA from State University." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander stood up slowly. "You're telling me my wife, who I hired as a maid, is actually a qualified financial analyst?" "Ex-maid," Elena corrected him with a small smile. "Remember our agreement? I'm your wife now, even if it's just for show." Alexander laughed suddenly, surprising both of them. It was a real laugh, not his usual controlled chuckle. "Well, Mrs. Pierce, would you care to look at these projections in detail?" For the next 2 hours, they worked together on the project. Elena found herself enjoying the familiar work, and Alexander was impressed by her quick insights and practical solutions. Meanwhile, Sophia was having her own adventure in the mansion's large kitchen. The little girl had been shy at first, but now she was helping Maria, the new maid, bake cookies. Alexander walked in to get coffee and found flour everywhere, including on Sophia's nose. "Mr. Pierce," Sophia said, worried. "I'm sorry about the mess." But instead of getting angry, Alexander grabbed a cookie from the cooling rack. "Is there enough flour left to make another batch?" he asked, making Sophia giggle. That evening, the three of them sat in the family room, something that had never happened before. Sophia was drawing pictures, while Elena reviewed more project documents. Alexander watched them both, feeling strangely content. "Why didn't you tell me about your background?" he asked Elena quietly. She looked up from her papers. "Would it have mattered? You needed a maid, and I needed the job. My degree doesn't help much when companies see the bankruptcy of TechGrow on my resume. They assume I was part of the problem." Alexander was silent for a moment. "Were you?" "No," Elena said firmly. "I actually warned the board about the risky investments months before everything fell apart. They didn't listen to me." Alexander nodded slowly. He had heard about TechGrow's collapse. It was big news in the tech world. A thought began forming in his mind. "Elena," he said carefully, "would you be interested in looking at some other projects? As a consultant, of course." "Paid consultant," he added quickly. She raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering your wife a job?" "I'm offering a qualified professional an opportunity," he corrected. "The fact that we're temporarily married is irrelevant." Sophia looked up from her drawing. "Mama, does this mean you'll wear pretty work clothes like before?" Elena smiled at her daughter. "Maybe, sweetheart. But remember, this is all temporary." "Why?" Sophia asked innocently. "Don't you like living here? Mr. Pierce lets me have cookies." Both adults fell silent, not sure how to answer. The truth was, things were becoming complicated. What had started as a simple arrangement was turning into something neither of them had expected. That night, as Alexander lay awake in his room, they had separate bedrooms. Of course, he realized something unsettling. For the first time in his life, he was actually enjoying having a family in his house. And that wasn't part of the plan at all. 1 month into their marriage, Alexander Pierce stood in front of his closet mirror, adjusting his tie for a fancy charity gala. These events used to be the highlight of his social calendar, but tonight, something felt different. He could hear Sophia's laughter floating up from downstairs, where she and Elena were probably having their usual dinner together. His phone buzzed. It was Thomas. "Hey, ready for the gala? A whole city's elite will be there." Alexander looked at his reflection and sighed. "Actually, I think I'll skip it tonight." There was a pause on the other end. "Skip it? You never skip these events." Are you sick? No, I just. Alexander struggled to explain. I promised Sophia I'd help her with her science project. It's due tomorrow. Thomas laughed. Wow, you're really committed to this act, aren't you? Don't forget, it's just a bet. Alexander felt a strange twist in his stomach at those words. He ended the call quickly and loosened his tie. Walking downstairs, he found Elena and Sophia at the kitchen table. Papers and craft supplies were spread everywhere, and a half-eaten pizza sat nearby. Mr. Pierce, Sophia called out excitedly. Look, we're making a model of the solar system. Elena looked up, surprised to see him still home. I thought you had your gala tonight. I did. I do. He shrugged, taking off his tie completely. But this looks more interesting. Need help? Sophia's face lit up. Can you help me paint Jupiter? It needs lots of stripes. Soon, Alexander found himself sitting at the kitchen table, his expensive suit jacket draped over a chair, carefully painting orange and brown stripes on a foam ball. Elena watched him with curiosity as she helped Sophia arrange the planets in order. You're missing your big social event, she said quietly while Sophia was distracted with glitter. I've been to hundreds of those galas, he replied, focusing on his painting. They're all the same, but this is Sophia's first science project in her new school. Elena studied him for a moment. You've changed, Alexander. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Is that a bad thing? Before she could answer, Sophia returned with more glitter. Mama, can Mr. Pierce come to my school presentation tomorrow? All the other kids' dads are coming. The room went quiet. Elena started to say something, but Alexander spoke first. I'd love to come, Sophia. What time is it? Later that night, after Sophia was in bed, Elena found Alexander in his office. He was looking at photos on his phone, pictures of the solar system project, including a selfie Sophia had insisted they take together. You didn't have to say yes to her presentation, Elena said from the doorway. I wanted to. He turned to face her. Elena, I need to tell you something. These past weeks? His phone buzzed again, interrupting him. Another message from Thomas. Missed you at the gala. Don't forget, only 5 months left on our bet. Alexander quickly put the phone face down, but Elena had seen him tense up. Is everything okay? She asked. Fine, he said quickly. Just work stuff. The lie felt heavy in his mouth. That night, neither of them slept well. Elena thought about how different Alexander was from the arrogant man who had hired her as a maid. He now helped Sophia with homework, joined them for dinner most nights, and even learned to make her daughter's favorite hot chocolate. Alexander, in his room, stared at the ceiling. When had his huge mansion started feeling like a real home? When had he started looking forward to simple family dinners more than expensive social events? And most troublingly, when had the bet started feeling like the biggest mistake of his life? The next day, Alexander sat proudly in the school auditorium, recording Sophia's presentation on his phone. His usual business meetings had been rescheduled, something the old Alexander would never have done. Elena sat beside him, and when Sophia successfully named all the planets in order, they both cheered loudly. Walking back to the car, Sophia between them holding both their hands, they looked like a real family. Several other parents smiled at them, and Alexander found himself smiling back, not even thinking about his usual professional image. Ice cream to celebrate? He suggested, making Sophia jump with joy. As they sat in the ice cream parlor, watching Sophia devour a huge sundae, Elena noticed something. Alexander had vanilla ice cream on his tie, his expensive designer tie, and he didn't even seem to care. The man who used to notice a speck of dust on his suit was now laughing at Sophia's ice cream mustache. The transformation was real. But what would happen when the truth about the bet finally came out? Elena walked through the quiet halls of Alexander's company building late one evening. She had forgotten her laptop after a long day of consulting on the new project. The office was almost empty, with just a few lights still on. As she approached the conference room, she heard familiar voices, Alexander and Thomas. She was about to call out a greeting when Thomas's words stopped her cold. 3 more months, Alex, and you win the bet. I have to admit, I didn't think you could pull it off. Getting the maid to marry you and actually living like a real family? Brilliant. Elena's hand flew to her mouth. Her legs felt weak as she pressed herself against the wall, listening. Thomas, I don't want to talk about the bet. Alexander's voice sounded strained. Why not? You're winning. Once the 6 months are up, you get my shares in Techstart, and you can divorce the maid. Though I have to say, she's surprisingly good with those financial reports. Who knew maids could be so clever? Alina's world spun. Everything. The marriage, the job offer, Alexander's transformation. It was all because of a bet. She felt sick to her stomach. That's enough, Thomas. Alexander's chair scraped against the floor. Oh, come on. Don't tell me you're actually getting attached. Remember, this was your idea. Marriage is just a social contract. Those were your exact words. Elena had heard enough. She turned and ran, tears blurring her vision. Her laptop forgotten. She rushed to the elevator, her heels clicking loudly in the empty hallway. Back home, she found Sophia asleep in her room, surrounded by the toys Alexander had bought her. Even her daughter's bedroom was a lie. Elena started packing immediately, her hands shaking as she threw clothes into suitcases. Alexander arrived home an hour later to find Elena in the living room, 2 packed suitcases beside her. Sophia's backpack sat ready by the door. Elena, what's wrong? He stopped short when he saw her face. A bet. Her voice was barely a whisper. I was just a bet to you. All the color drained from Alexander's face. Elena, let me explain. Explain what? Her voice rose. How you made a drunken bet to marry your maid, how you used my daughter's medical bills to manipulate me, how you pretended to change, to care about us. It's not like that anymore. Then what is it like? Elena stood up, her eyes flashing with anger and hurt. Was anything real? Or was it all just a game to win some company shares? Alexander stepped toward her, his hands raised pleadingly. Please, listen to me. Yes, it started as a bet, but things changed. I changed. What I feel for you and Sophia. Don't. Elena's voice cracked. Don't you dare say Sophia's name. You used a sick child to win a bet. What kind of person does that? The sound of small feet made them both turn. Sophia stood in the hallway, clutching her teddy bear, tears in her eyes. Mama? Why are you shouting? Elena quickly wiped her eyes. Baby, we have to go. Pack your favorite toys, okay? But why? Don't you like Mr. Pierce anymore? Sophia looked between them, confused and scared. Alexander took another step forward. Elena, please. We can talk about this. I know I was wrong, but... Wrong? Elena laughed bitterly. You were cruel. And stupid. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think you could just play house with us for 6 months and then throw us away? She picked up the suitcases. Sophia, honey, get your backpack. Elena, wait. Alexander's voice was desperate now. Where will you go? Back to our old apartment. I kept it, just in case. Turns out I was right not to trust this fairy tale. She looked at him one last time. Congratulations, Mr. Pierce. You'll win your bet. But you've lost something far more valuable. As Elena drove away, Sophia crying in the back seat, Alexander stood in his doorway watching them leave. His huge mansion suddenly felt emptier than it ever had before. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photos. Sophia's science project, family dinners, ice cream outings. None of it had been in the original bet. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Pierce, the man who had everything, felt truly poor. For the first time in years, Alexander Pierce missed a week of work. He sat in his empty mansion, surrounded by the evidence of the family that had briefly filled his home. Sophia's drawings still hung on the refrigerator. Elena's coffee mug sat unwashed in the sink. She had been in such a hurry to leave. He walked into Sophia's room, now eerily quiet. Her stuffed animals were arranged neatly on the bed. She had only taken her favorite teddy bear. On her desk lay the solar system project they had made together. Jupiter's stripes, which he had painted so carefully, were slightly messy. He picked it up, remembering her excited face when she got an A+ on the presentation. His phone kept ringing. Thomas had called 20 times, but Alexander couldn't bear to talk to him. The company shares, the bet, the Pierce Tower project, none of it seemed important anymore. Late one night, after too many glasses of whiskey, he found himself watching videos on his phone. There was Sophia attempting to make pancakes, giggling as she spilled flour everywhere. Elena teaching her to fold paper airplanes in the backyard. The 3 of them at the zoo, where Sophia had named all the animals in both English and Spanish. When did I become this person? He asked his empty living room. When did money stop being enough? He thought back to his life before Elena and Sophia. Sure, he had everything money could buy, but he'd never had anyone to share it with. No one had ever made him chocolate chip cookies just because they knew he liked them, like Sophia did. No one had ever challenged his business decisions or called him out on his arrogance, like Elena did. One morning, his housekeeper Maria found him asleep in Sophia's room, clutching a small pink sweater the little girl had left behind. "Mr. Pierce," she said gently, "you need to eat something." He looked up at her with bloodshot eyes. "I had everything, Maria, a beautiful wife, an amazing daughter, a real family. And I lost it all because of my stupid pride." Maria sat down beside him, something she would never have done before. "Then maybe it's time to decide what kind of man you want to be." That afternoon, Alexander finally answered one of Thomas's calls. "Alex, where have you been? The Tech Start deal." "I don't care about the deal," Alexander cut him off. "Or the bet. Or the shares." "What? But you're winning. Just 2 more months and—" "The bet is off, Thomas. I forfeit. You can have full control of the Pierce Tower project." "Are you crazy? This isn't like you at all." Alexander laughed sadly. "No, it isn't like the old me, and that's a good thing." He spent the next few days thinking about who he used to be, the arrogant millionaire who thought everything had a price. He remembered how he used to treat his employees, his friends, even Elena when she was just his maid. The memory made him cringe. In his home office, he found the financial reports Elena had been working on. Her notes were precise and intelligent, showing insights his entire team had missed. She wasn't just a maid playing at being a businesswoman. She was brilliant at what she did. "I never even told her," he realized. "I never told her how impressive she was, how much I respected her work." There were so many things he had never said. He had never told Sophia how proud he was when she learned to ride her bike in the driveway. He had never told Elena how much he admired her strength as a single mother, or how her smile had become the best part of his day. One evening, he found himself driving to their old apartment building. He sat in his car, looking up at their window. A light was on, and he could see shadows moving inside. His hand reached for the door handle, but he stopped himself. "They deserve better," he whispered to himself. "They deserve someone who values them for who they are, not what they're worth." As he drove home, Alexander Pierce made a decision. If he ever got a second chance, he would be that better person. Not for a bet, not for show, but because his family, and yes, he finally admitted to himself that's what they had become, deserved nothing less. The mansion that had once seemed like a symbol of his success now felt like a monument to his biggest failure. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change the ending of this story. The grand ballroom of the City Plaza Hotel was packed with the city's wealthiest people for the annual charity gala. Alexander stood at the podium, looking different than usual. His expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he had lost weight, and dark circles showed under his eyes. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Many of you have known me for years as a successful businessman, someone who always got what he wanted, no matter the cost." In the back of the room, hidden behind a pillar, Elena stood watching. She hadn't planned to come, but Maria, the housekeeper, had called her, insisting she needed to see this. Sophia was at home with a babysitter, unaware her mother was here. "But success isn't just about money," Alexander continued. "Sometimes the richest man can be the poorest in what really matters." His hands gripped the podium tightly. "I'm here tonight to tell you a story about a bet." The crowd murmured. Thomas, sitting in the front row, shifted uncomfortably. 2 months ago, I made a bet that I could marry someone and make it look real for 6 months. I chose my maid, a single mother with a sick daughter." Alexander's voice cracked slightly. "I thought I was so clever. I offered to pay for her daughter's medical bills in exchange for marriage. Just another business deal, right?" Elena pressed her hand to her mouth, tears forming in her eyes. She had never expected this public confession. "What I didn't know was that this woman, Elena Rodriguez, would teach me what real wealth looks like. She showed me that true richness isn't in your bank account. It's in morning pancakes with an 8-year-old girl. It's in family dinners and science projects and simple moments of joy." The room was completely silent now. Even the waiters had stopped serving drinks to listen. I also didn't know that Elena was a brilliant financial analyst who had lost her job when her company went bankrupt. She helped save one of my biggest projects, not because she had to, but because she saw a problem and knew how to fix it. That's who she is, someone who makes things better just by being there. Alexander took a deep breath. I'm standing here tonight to announce two things. First, I'm creating the Sophia Foundation, named after Elena's daughter. This foundation will provide full medical care for children whose families can't afford it. I'm starting it with a personal donation of $50 million. Gasps filled the room. Thomas stood up, trying to catch Alexander's eye, but Alexander ignored him. Second, I'm stepping down as CEO of my company for the next 6 months. During this time, I'll be working directly with the foundation, visiting hospitals, meeting families. I need to learn what real people go through when they're not born with every advantage. Elena felt tears rolling down her cheeks. This was not the same man who had arrogantly proposed their marriage deal. To Elena and Sophia, if you ever hear about this speech, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I treated your love and trust like commodities to be bought and sold. You deserve better. His voice shook with emotion. I know I've lost the right to be part of your family, but you've changed me forever, and I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the man you thought I could be. As Alexander stepped away from the podium, the room erupted in applause. People stood up, some wiping tears from their eyes. Even Thomas looked moved. But Alexander didn't see any of this. He walked quickly toward the exit, his speech done, his heart heavy but his conscience finally clear. He was almost at the door when he heard a familiar voice. Did you mean it? Alexander turned around slowly. Elena stood there, her eyes red from crying but her face full of something that looked almost like hope. Every word, he whispered. The foundation, you named it after Sophia. She taught me what real courage looks like. Fighting through pain with a smile, never giving up. He paused. Just like her mother. Elena took a small step forward. You're really giving up being CEO. The company doesn't matter anymore. I need to become someone better. He looked into her eyes. Not for a bet. Not for show. But because you and Sophia showed me what really matters in life. They stood there in silence, the noise of the gala fading into the background. The next move would be hers, and Alexander knew he would accept whatever she decided. He had finally learned that real love meant wanting what was best for others, even if it hurt you. 6 months after the charity gala, the local children's hospital looked very different. The newly built Sophia wing sparkled in the morning sun, its walls decorated with colorful murals of animals and planets. Inside, Alexander sat on a tiny chair, reading a storybook to a group of sick children. His designer suits had been replaced by casual clothes, and his once perfect hair was slightly messy from children running their hands through it. Mr. Pierce. A small voice called out. He looked up to see Sophia running toward him, Elena following behind with a warm smile. There's my favorite science expert. Alexander caught Sophia in a hug. Over the past months, he and Elena had slowly rebuilt their relationship, starting with supervised visits so Sophia could see the man she had grown to care about. Guess what? Sophia bounced excitedly. My doctor said I don't need any more surgeries. The last one worked perfectly. Alexander's eyes met Elena's over Sophia's head. They both remembered the dark days when they weren't sure if Sophia would ever be completely healthy. That calls for a celebration, he said, standing up. How about ice cream? Actually, Elena stepped forward. We came to ask you something else. She looked nervous but determined. Sophia has a school play next week. She wants you to come. Please, Mr. Pierce? Sophia grabbed his hand. I'm playing the sun in our solar system play. Remember when we made the planets together? Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Later that evening, they sat in the small ice cream parlor they used to visit as a family. Sophia was busy creating the perfect sundae while Elena and Alexander talked quietly. You've really changed, Elena said, watching him help Sophia arrange her toppings. The foundation, the hospital visits, stepping down as CEO. I had good teachers, he replied softly. A brilliant woman who showed me that success isn't about money, and a brave little girl who taught me about unconditional love. Elena reached across the table and took his hand. Thomas came to see me yesterday. Alexander tensed. What did he want? To apologize. He told me something interesting. She squeezed his hand. He said you gave him full control of the Pierce Tower project months ago. You could have won the bet, but you forfeited. The bet stopped mattering the moment I realized what I was losing. Alexander looked at their joined hands. Alina, Mama. Sophia interrupted, ice cream dripping down her chin. Can Mr. Pierce come to dinner tomorrow, and the next day, and maybe forever? Both adults laughed, breaking the tension, but Alina didn't let go of Alexander's hand. The next week, after Sophia's successful performance as the sun, complete with a glittery yellow costume, they walked through the park together. Sophia ran ahead to feed the ducks, leaving them alone. Do you remember what you said to me when I first hired you as a maid? Alexander asked suddenly. Alina thought back. I said I wouldn't pretend to be madly in love. And now? She stopped walking and turned to face him. Now I don't have to pretend. Alexander pulled a small box from his pocket. I did this all wrong the first time. Making a bet, offering a deal. This time, I'm just a man asking the woman he loves to marry him. For real. Alina looked at the ring, then at Sophia feeding the ducks, and finally at Alexander's hopeful face. No deals? No bets? Just love, he promised. And maybe a few more science projects. Then yes, she whispered, yes. Sophia's excited squeal told them she had been watching. She ran back and threw herself into their arms, creating a family hug right there in the park. A month later, they had a simple wedding in the hospital's garden, surrounded by the children Alexander had helped through the foundation. Thomas served as best man, his redemption complete after becoming the foundation's biggest donor. Sophia insisted on being both flower girl and ring bearer, wearing a dress covered in planets and stars. As they exchanged vows, Alexander looked at his bride and daughter and realized something. The bet that had started everything had been about proving that marriage was just a business deal. Instead, it had proved him completely wrong. Real love, as it turned out, was the one thing his money could never have bought. That evening, in their home, no longer a cold mansion but a warm family home, Sophia hung up her solar system project in the living room. Jupiter's stripes were still a little messy, but to Alexander, it was the most beautiful piece of art he had ever seen. Because this time, their story wasn't beginning with a bet. It was beginning with love.